She was a widow with a well that had nearly given up giving water, and a name the town had already decided not to trust. She rose before light each morning to carry what little she could from the creek, her arms aching long before the sun cleared the ridge, and she told herself, as she had told herself every day since the funeral, that this was simply what surviving looked like now. He arrived the way men like him always seemed to, without announcement, without explanation, 2 buckets in his hands and his hat already off. He did not ask if she needed help. He did not wait to be thanked. He set the water by her door and walked back toward his own fences. And the only thing he left behind was the quiet sound of a man who expected nothing in return. The town had a word for women alone, and it was rarely a kind one. They watched her from behind curtains and countertops, certain that a homestead without a husband was a homestead already lost. They did not see the small things. The porch swept clean each evening, the fence mended without being asked, the lamp left burning a little longer some nights than others. They were not looking for those things. They were waiting for her to fail. But there are men who speak in chores instead of words, who measure their devotion not in promises but in buckets carried and boards replaced, and who let a season pass before they let themselves want something they were not certain they deserved. And there are women who learn slowly, painfully, that being looked after is not the same as being pitied, that some men do not come to take, but to stay. What began as water carried in silence before the rest of the world had woken would not stay simple for long. Before the first snow fell, something would be asked that neither of them had dared to say aloud, and the town that had been so certain of how her story would end was about to be proven wrong, one quiet morning at a time. She arrived at widowhood the way most women on the frontier did, without warning and without ceremony, on a Tuesday in late summer, when the wheat was still green and her husband was thrown from a wagon on the road to town. Willa Hart was 26 years old when they buried Samuel beneath the cottonwood at the edge of their land, and she stood at the grave in a dress that had been mended twice already, and she did not cry where anyone could see her. The neighbors who came brought bread and casseroles and quiet words, and within a month most of them had stopped coming at all. A widow with no children and a homestead too large for one pair of hands was, in the eyes of the town, a problem that would solve itself eventually. They simply did not know which way it would go. The well had been failing since spring, long before Samuel died, and by the time the first frost threatened in October, it gave up little more than a trickle each morning, brown with silt and barely fit for the horses. Willa rose before the sun to walk the half-mile to the creek with 2 buckets and a yoke worn smooth by her husband's shoulders before they had ever fit her own. The water was heavy and the path was uneven, and she had learned to carry it the way a person learns anything that must be done daily and without complaint. Not gracefully, but steadily, one foot set after the other. By the time she reached the house again, her arms would ache clean through to the bone, and she would set the buckets by the stove and start the morning, as though the walk had cost her nothing at all. The town of Larkspur sat 4 miles south, a cluster of clapboard buildings around a dry goods store, and a church with a bell that rang too loud for its size. Willa went in on Saturdays for flour and coffee and whatever else the homestead could not provide for itself, and she felt the eyes on her every time, the way a person feels weather before it arrives. Mabel Tillis, who ran the counter at the dry goods store and considered herself the moral compass of the county, had a way of looking at Willa that suggested she had already written the ending of her story and found it lacking. "A woman alone out there," Mabel would say to whoever stood near enough to hear, "is a woman asking for trouble, one way or another." She never said it directly to Willa's face. She did not need to. There was a man named Otis Pruitt who had taken to appearing at the homestead every few weeks, always with some reason for the visit and always with an offer underneath it. He wanted the south pasture, he said, the good grazing land that ran along the creek, and he was willing to pay what he called a fair price, though everyone who heard the number knew it was not fair at all. He would stand at the fence with his hat pushed back and his thumbs in his belt, looking over the land the way a man looks at something he has already decided belongs to him. Willa always told him the land was not for sale, and he always nodded as though he expected that answer and intended to ask again, regardless. He was not unkind, exactly. He was simply a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through patience rather than force. The homestead itself told the story of a year without a husband better than any words could. The barn door hung crooked on its hinge. The fence along the east pasture had 3 rails down where a storm had taken them in June, and Willa had propped them as best she could with rope and good intention, knowing it would not hold past the first hard winter. The chimney drew poorly on windy nights, filling the front room with smoke until she learned to crack the door just enough to let it breathe. She managed these things the way she managed everything since Samuel, with a kind of grim and quiet competence that asked for no sympathy, because she had learned, early and thoroughly, that sympathy in Larkspur came with conditions attached. On the Tuesday morning that would later mark itself in her memory as the day everything began to shift, Willa woke before dawn as she always did, dressed in the dark, and reached for the yoke by the door only to find her hands shaking with a tiredness that had nothing to do with sleep. She had not eaten well in days, not because there was no food, but because eating alone in a silent house had become a chore she no longer had the will for. She stood at the door a long moment, looking out at the gray light just beginning to touch the ridge, and she thought, not for the first time, that perhaps Mabel Tillis was right after all. Perhaps a woman alone out here was simply waiting for the land to win. She did not know, as she lifted the yoke onto shoulders too thin for the weight, that a man named Nathan Cooper had taken up residence on the old Hargrove place 2 sections over. A quiet man who had arrived in Larkspur some months back with little more than a horse, a toolbox, and a reputation that preceded him only in the sense that no one had managed to build one yet. He kept to himself. He worked from sunup to past dark on a property that had been neglected for years, and he came to town only when supplies demanded it, speaking rarely and never about himself. Some men commanded a room when they entered it. Nathan Cooper was not one of them. He was the kind of man people noticed only after he had already done something, and even then, only if they happened to be looking. The creek path Willa walked each morning ran along the boundary between her land and the section Nathan now worked, though she had never once seen him there, not in all the weeks since his arrival. She had heard his name mentioned in town, passed between women at the counter with the particular curiosity reserved for any new and unmarried man. But she had paid it little mind. A new neighbor was simply one more variable in a life that already held too many. She had no room left for curiosity about anyone, least of all a stranger who kept his business to himself and his fences mended, by all accounts, better than her own. She walked the path that morning with her eyes on the ground, watching for roots and stones the way she always did, the buckets empty and swinging light against the yoke. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge, and the world held that particular hush that belongs only to the hour before full light, when even the birds seemed to be waiting for permission to begin. She did not look up until she was nearly at the creek, and when she did, there was nothing there to see. Only water moving low over stone, and the cottonwoods standing bare-armed against the brightening sky, and her own breath fogging faint in the cold. She knelt and filled the first bucket, then the second, and she did not yet know that this was the last morning she would carry that water alone. The next morning, Willa found 2 buckets already standing full beside her door when she stepped out into the gray light. She stood looking at them for a long moment, certain at first that her tired mind was playing some trick on her. The water was clean, clear in a way the creek rarely offered this late in the season, and the buckets themselves were not her own. She looked toward the tree line where the path to Nathan's section ran, and saw nothing but the pines standing still in the cold morning air. She carried the water inside without a word to anyone because there was no one to say it to, and she set it by the stove the way she always did. It happened again the following morning, and the one after that, until it became something she no longer questioned so much as waited for. She never saw him arrive. She only saw the evidence of him, the bucket set square by the door. The yoke hung neatly on its peg, rather than left leaning where she had dropped it the night before. Once she found a section of the east fence repaired, the rails she had propped with rope now nailed firm and true, and she stood at the gate a long while with her hand resting on the new wood, feeling the kind of quiet that comes when a person realizes they have not been entirely forgotten by the world after all. She did not thank him because she had no chance to, and he did not wait around to be thanked. She finally saw him on a Thursday, a full week into this silent arrangement, when she rose earlier than usual and stepped outside just as the sky was turning from black to the deep blue that comes before any color at all. He was at the well, not the creek, working a length of rope and a bucket down into the dark water with the patient care of a man who had done the same task 100 times before. He heard her step on the porch and straightened, removing his hat in a single, unhurried motion, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Ma'am," he said finally, and that was all. She asked him why, and he looked at the well rather than at her, the way a man looks at something he is trying to place. And he said only that a place ought to have water, and that he had time enough most mornings before his own work called him. His name, she learned that morning, was Nathan Cooper, and he offered little else beyond it. He did not explain where he had come from before Larkspur, and she did not ask, sensing that the question would be met with the same quiet deflection he seemed to offer everything. He worked the Hargrove section alone, 2 miles north, and from what little she had heard in town, he had taken a property that most men considered too far gone to bother with, and had begun, slowly and without announcement, to prove them wrong. He was tall in the way that made a doorway feel smaller, and his hands were the hands of a man who had never once been afraid of work. He did not look at her the way Otis Pruitt looked at her land. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he intends to solve without making a show of solving it. The water kept coming each morning, and slowly other things began to follow it. A length of stovepipe, replaced without comment, left the front room free of smoke for the first time in months. A new hinge on the barn door, set so quietly she did not notice until she swung the door, and it moved without complaint for the first time since spring. He never knocked. He never lingered. He simply did what needed doing and was gone again before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and Willa found herself rising earlier each day. Not to catch him at it, she told herself, but only because the work of the homestead demanded an early start regardless. Mabel Tillis noticed before Willa ever said a word about it, the way certain women in certain towns always seem to notice things before they are spoken aloud. "I hear Mr. Cooper's been making himself useful out at your place," she said one Saturday at the counter, weighing flour with a precision that suggested she was weighing something else entirely. Willa said only that he had been kind, and Mabel's mouth tightened in a way that conveyed a great deal without conveying anything she could later be accused of saying outright. "Kindness has a way of costing a woman more than she expects," Mabel said, and turned to the next customer before Willa could answer. The walk home that day felt longer than usual, though the road had not changed. Otis Pruitt came again the following week, leaning at the fence with his hat pushed back, and this time his offer for the south pasture had risen by a small margin, as though he sensed some change in the wind and wished to close his business before it shifted entirely. He asked, almost in passing, whether the new man at the Hargrove place had been bothering her, and there was something underneath the question that Willa did not care for, a thread of proprietary concern from a man who had no claim to either the concern or the property. She told him evenly, that Mr. Cooper had not bothered her at all, and that the land remained not for sale. Otis nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is recalculating rather than agreeing, and rode off without further comment. The evenings began to carry a different weight than they had before. Willa found herself cooking a little more than the meal required, setting aside a portion of cornbread or a jar of preserves on the porch railing some nights, never with explanation, never acknowledged in words the next morning beyond the fact that the jar would be empty and washed clean, returned to the railing as though it had never moved. It became its own kind of conversation, conducted entirely in the language of small offerings left and small offerings taken, neither of them willing to name what was happening between them because naming it felt, to both, like something that might frighten it away. One evening in late October, as the light failed early and the air carried the first true bite of the coming winter, Willa stepped onto the porch to find Nathan there. Not working, simply standing at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hands as though he had walked the distance for a reason he had not yet decided how to voice. He asked after the fence, and she answered, and he asked after the well, and she answered that too, and the conversation moved in this slow, circling way for several minutes before either of them said anything that mattered. Finally, he said that he did not mind the walk each morning, that it gave him reason to start the day before the day demanded it of him. She said that she had noticed, and that she was grateful, though gratitude felt like too small a word for what she meant. He nodded once, set his hat back on his head, and said only, "Good night, ma'am," before turning back toward the tree line, and she stood on the porch a long while after he had gone, watching the place where the dark had swallowed him. November came in dry and hard, the kind of dry that settled into the bones of a place and refused to lift. The well that Nathan had cleared and deepened back in October began to falter again under the strain of a season that had given the valley almost no rain since August, and Willa watched the water level drop a little more each morning, the bucket scraping silt before it ever reached its fill. The creek ran low as well, thin and brown between its banks, and for the first time since Samuel's death, she allowed herself to consider, briefly and without saying it aloud, that the land itself might simply be done with her. She did not speak this thought to anyone. She carried it the way she carried everything, quietly and without complaint. The town's pressure sharpened as the drought wore on, the way pressure always sharpens when people grow afraid for their own land and look for somewhere else to set their worry. Mabel Tillis took to remarking, with increasing frequency, that a widow alone could not be expected to weather a hard winter on failing ground, and that it would be a kindness, really, for Willa to consider selling before the cold made the decision for her. Otis Pruitt's visits grew more frequent and his offers more pointed, no longer mentioning only the south pasture but the whole of the homestead, framed each time as concern dressed up to look like generosity. Willa held her ground in both cases, though holding it cost her more each time than she let anyone see. The strain showed in smaller ways at the homestead itself. A late frost took what remained of the kitchen garden in a single night, blackening the last of the squash and beans she had hoped to carry her through the coldest months. She stood at the fence the next morning looking at the ruined rows, her breath fogging in the cold, and she felt something in her chest pulled tight in a way it had not allowed itself to since the funeral. She did not cry. She had long since learned that crying changed nothing about a frozen garden, and so she simply stood a while longer, and then she went inside and began counting what stores remained, because counting was a thing a person could do something about. Nathan noticed the garden before she ever mentioned it, the way he noticed most things without being told. He said nothing about it directly, but the following week a sack of dried beans and a crate of late-season apples appeared on the porch, left in the same wordless way as the water and the mended fence rails, and Willa understood without being told where they had come from. She did not refuse them. She had learned, slowly and against some early resistance, that accepting what was offered plainly and without strings was not the same as being pitied, and that there was a kind of dignity in letting a person help that she had not expected to find. The well finally gave out entirely on a Tuesday in mid-November, the bucket coming up with nothing but mud and the faint metallic smell of a thing run dry. Willa stood over it a long moment, hands on the rope, and felt the particular exhaustion of a person watching the last reliable thing in her life fail along with everything else. She did not call for Nathan. She had never once called for him in all the weeks of his quiet help, and some stubborn part of her resisted doing so now. But he came anyway that evening, as he often did on no particular schedule, and found her sitting on the porch steps with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He asked what was wrong, and for the first time since Samuel's death, Willa told someone the truth of how things stood. All of it. The well and the frost and the garden and the slow erosion of a future she had been trying to hold together with rope and stubbornness. She had not meant to say so much. The words came anyway, plain and unadorned, the way a dam gives way not with drama but simply because it has held longer than it was built to. Nathan listened without interrupting, his hat in his hands, his eyes on her rather than on the failing well, and when she finished, he was quiet a long moment before he spoke. "I've got water enough on my section to share," he said, "and hands enough to dig you a new well come spring, if the old one's truly done." It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of statement that asked for anything in return, and yet something in the plainness of it landed differently than anything he had said before. Willa looked at him then. Really. Looked, the way a woman looks at a thing she has been afraid to name, and she saw perhaps for the first time that the quiet in him was not distance. It was simply the shape a careful man's devotion took when he had no intention of asking for credit. He sat down on the step beside her, not above her, not standing over her the way a man might stand over a problem he intended to manage, but beside her, the careful distance of a man who understood the difference between closeness and intrusion. The evening had gone cold, the kind of cold that arrives early in November and announces the winter to come, and after a long while, without any particular fanfare, his hand came to rest on the step between them, close enough that the back of it brushed against hers, not over her hand, beside it. Some things are too large for naming, and he did not try to name this one. He simply let the nearness say what neither of them was yet prepared to say outright. They sat that way until the cold finally drove them both inside, and at the door he paused, hat already in hand, and said only that he would come by in the morning to see about hauling water from his own well until the new one could be dug. Willa said that would be kind of him, and he said it was no trouble, and the exchange was as plain and unremarkable as 100 others they had shared since the first morning the buckets appeared at her door. But something had shifted in the saying of it, some understanding that had been building quietly for weeks and had finally found its surface. Not unkindly, but without any hurry, the distance between them had narrowed into something neither of them was willing to call by its true name just yet, though both of them, in their own quiet way, had begun to. The first snow came on a Wednesday, early for the valley and heavier than expected, the kind of snow that settled over the pines by mid-morning and showed no sign of stopping by noon. Willa stood at her window watching it fall, the new well. Nathan had dug only weeks before now capped and waiting beneath a soft white mound, and she felt something in her chest that had not been there in over a year, a kind of quiet readiness she could not entirely name. The garden was gone for the season, the fences were mended, the woodpile stood high against the side of the house, and for the first time since Samuel's death, the coming winter did not feel like a thing to merely survive. Nathan had taken to coming by most evenings now, no longer only in the mornings with water, but in the slow hours after supper, when the work of the day was done and there was nothing left to do but sit. He brought little with him most nights beyond himself, sometimes a length of harness to mend, sometimes nothing at all, content simply to occupy the chair across from hers while the fire worked its way through the evening. They spoke more now than they once had, though the conversation remained the same in its bones, plain and unhurried, more often about the land and the weather than about anything either of them might have called feeling. And yet the silences between the words had grown warmer, the way silence does between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. The town had not entirely softened, not yet, but something in its posture toward Willa had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Mabel Tillis still watched her across the counter with the same measuring eye, but the comments had grown shorter, less certain of their own conclusion, as though even Mabel could see that the story she had been so sure of was not unfolding the way she had predicted. Otis Pruitt had stopped coming by the homestead altogether sometime after the well was dug, his offers withdrawn without ceremony, the way a man withdraws from a negotiation he has quietly recognized he has already lost. The town, Willa had come to understand, did not apologize the way people in books apologized. It simply grew quiet, and the quiet was as close to an apology as Larkspur was ever going to give. On the evening the snow began in earnest. Nathan arrived later than usual, his coat dusted white at the shoulders, and he stood at the door a long moment before stepping inside, as though the cold outside had given him time enough to settle something in his mind. He did not sit by the fire as he usually did. He stood near the window instead, looking out at the snow falling thick over the corral where his horse stood waiting, patient and unbothered by the weather, the way animals often are when their owners are not. Willa asked if something was wrong, and he turned to her then, his hat already in his hands, and said that nothing was wrong at all, that he had simply been turning something over and had decided it was past time to say it plainly. He told her, in the same unadorned way he told her most things, that he had not come to Larkspur looking for a wife, and that he had not set out that first morning with the buckets, intending anything beyond a neighborly kindness to a woman managing more than any one person should have to manage alone. But somewhere in the carrying of the water, he said, and in the mending of the fence, and in the long quiet evenings that had followed, something had changed in him that he had not expected and had not entirely known how to name until now. He said he was not a man with much to offer beyond a section of land, 2 strong hands, and a willingness to work it for the rest of his days. And then he asked her plainly, without flourish, whether she would have him as a husband, not out of need or convenience, but because he could no longer imagine the mornings without her on the other end of them. Willa did not answer right away. She stood a long moment in the firelight, looking at this quiet man who had never once asked her for anything, who had given a year's worth of unspoken devotion in buckets of water and mended fences, and a well dug deep enough to outlast any drought the valley might offer again. She thought of Samuel, briefly and without sorrow, the way a person thinks of a door once closed, and now simply part of the house's history. And she thought of the year behind her, the well failing, the garden frozen, the town waiting for her to fall, and how through all of it there had been one steady hand at the edge of her life, asking for nothing and giving everything regardless. She said yes plainly, the way he had asked, and something in his face moved, the corner of his mouth lifting in a way she had rarely seen, the way a man's face moves when he has been holding something carefully for a long time and is finally permitted to set it down. They were married before the month was out in the small church in Larkspur, with its bell too loud for its size, and the town that had once watched Willa with suspicion came that day to watch her with something closer to quiet goodwill. Mabel Tillis sat near the back and said nothing at all, which from Mabel was as close to a blessing as anyone expected to receive. There was no grand celebration, no dancing late into the night, only a simple supper afterward at the homestead, cornbread and molasses, and the kind of food that tasted, that evening, like something more than it had any right to be. Some things are too large for naming, and the quiet happiness in that room was one of them. The winter that followed was hard, as winters in that valley always were, but it was not a winter Willa faced alone. The well held strong against the frost. The woodpile lasted. The fences stood firm against the wind that came down off the ridge most nights, rattling the shutters, but never quite finding its way inside. And each morning, before the sun had fully cleared that same ridge, Nathan rose first, as he always had, and saw to the water and the stock before the day demanded anything more of either of them, not because anyone asked it of him, but because it was simply, by then, the shape his love had always taken. The wind moved through the pines above the homestead the way it always had, carrying the same cold scent of snow and wood smoke it carried every winter in that valley, indifferent to the lives unfolding beneath it. The fire in the hearth burned steady through the long nights, throwing its light against walls that had once held only silence and now held the sound of two people speaking softly over supper. The horse stood in the corral, breath fogging in the cold, waiting each morning for the same quiet man to come and see to him before the work of the day began. The river beyond the ridge ran low and slow beneath its skin of ice, patient the way rivers are patient, certain that spring would come again, as it always had. The fire burned. The world continued. And that was the story of Willa Hart and Nathan Cooper, a woman who carried her own water through the hardest year of her life, and a man who, without ever asking for anything in return, made certain she would not have to carry it alone again. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.